Hello and welcome to another video. This one is in the category of motoring, or it's in the motorcycle vlog video section, but there's actually no motorcycling involved. So if you're thinking you're going to sit through and watch me riding around the Highlands on my bike or riding the Spider somewhere and seeing the scenery, that's not going to happen in this one. What I am going to do is talk about politics a little bit, but before you turn off, I'm only just going to mention politics to get onto the second subject, which is to talk about something called CAFE standards. Now, I'll explain both of those things a little later on, but let me assure you that CAFE standards are not to do with health regulations, and they're nothing to do with the place where you get your coffee or where you meet your friends on Sundays and have smashed avocado and Vegemite. They are related to motoring, as I said. Now, before I go any further, though, I should say that all the photos that I've used in this video have come from the car sales website, where I assume that cars are put because they're going to be sold. I don't intend to breach anybody's copyright or breach anybody's privacy by taking the photograph, and wherever possible I've blurred number plates and things like that. And I should also say that the photographs are not intended to endorse or to criticise any model of car, any make of car, any variation of any model of any car. They're there simply to be things for you to look at while I talk about what it is I want to talk about. Alright, all of those things out of the way, let's get on with what the subject of this talk is going to be about. And I said I was going to talk about politics and CAFE standards. So let's do the politics first. In Australia, there are three things that are part of the political theatre of the country. One of those is an election. Every time there's an election, the politicians get all excited, the media get excited, and everybody gets excited because there could be a change of government and there's opinion polling and all that sort of thing. Another thing that's part of the theatre of politics in Australia is the opening of a new parliament, especially a federal parliament, because it brings together the politicians from all over Australia. That happens after there's been an election. Whether there's a change of government or the same government's returned, there's an official ceremony for the opening of parliament. And the other big piece of political theatre is one thing that happens every year, and that is the handing down of the federal budget. The state budgets are not quite as theatrical because they only affect the people who live in that state rather than the Commonwealth or federal budget, which affects everybody in the nation. And it's a piece of theatre for a number of reasons. On the day that it's presented, in this case it was presented about a week ago in early May of 2023, the Treasurer of the day stands at the dispatch box, as it's called, in the Parliament, and tells the Parliament how they intend to spend the nation's money, which programs they're supporting, what things they're going to do with that money, what things they're no longer going to do with that money, what programs the previous government had that they no longer support, and so on. And so for at least for that period of time, it's the Treasurer who's in the limelight rather than the Prime Minister. Now, in the weeks leading up to the budget, this is where the theatre comes in, because in the weeks leading up to the budget, there is an endless round of speculation by journalists and commentators and experts about what's going to be in the budget, or what should be in the budget, or what's not going to be in the budget, or what shouldn't be in the budget. Sometimes the government lets those things run, because if it's a good thing that the people say they're going to do, and the government is going to do it, then they get lots of good publicity and their opinion poll ratings go up and so on. If it's a bad thing, the government lets it run for a while to get the public used to the idea and see what the public thinks about it, and then they decide whether they'll go ahead with that particular thing or not, or they say, well, by the time we actually bring down the budget, the measure won't be as bad as whatever they thought it was. We'll tweak it a little bit, make it seem not so bad, but the public will have heard so much about it that it won't seem as terrible when it's announced on budget night, because we've been talking about it for weeks and weeks and weeks. Now, on budget night and the week or so following, the Treasurer and the Prime Minister do the round of talk shows and political shows and the radio shows and try to sell the budget, as if the general public has any say in whether the budget is accepted or not. It's handed down by the government. The government says, this is what we're going to do with your money, and then they present some bills to the Parliament. And in most cases, since they have the majority in the lower house, those bills are passed, and then they might be slightly modified in the Senate. When those the big ticket items, the big budget items, the ones that cost tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars, they make the front page of the newspapers, they make the splash screen on the websites, they make the lead story on the evening news, and the podcasters who talk about all these things. So that sort of big item becomes where the government says, like, we're going to spend several $100 million doing this or that, becomes a big item on the news for about a week, and then the budget sort of is implemented and people go on with their lives. I say it's 30 because the politicians who present the budget love it. The politicians who oppose the budget love it because they can say to the government, all those things you're doing are wrong, and if we were in power, we'd have done these things instead. The journalists love it because they get to talk endlessly about what they think the government should do, and all the experts, the economists and the lobby groups and so on, they all love it because they get a chance to have their 2 bobs worth about what should or shouldn't be in the budget. For the most people, it hardly affects them. Some people might get a tax cut, some people might get some money, some groups might get some money, some people who are getting some money at the moment might find it a bit harder to keep that money, or they might get a bit less, or the increase that they thought they were going to get, they don't get. But for most people, they just go on with their lives, and if you don't smoke and don't drink, then you're not affected by the increase in tobacco excise or alcohol excise. And so lots of things in the budget are more, as I say, political theatre. But this year, tucked away in this budget paper number 2, which was about a 250-page document, on about a page 171 was an item called decarbonising transport. And this is where we're going to get to the CAFE standards in a moment. And under this decarbonising transport heading was a statement by the government that said they were going to spend something like $7.3 million over 4 years. So when you work that out, that's about $1 and a bit million every year for 4 years. So it's kind of the loose change you find down the back of the lounge these days, or the change you keep in the console of the car. But they were going to spend this money to develop what are called CAFE standards. Now, CAFE in this context stands for Combined Average Fuel Efficiency Standard. And what it means is almost exactly what the words say. So every vehicle manufacturer who sells cars in Australia, their entire fleet, so that's the combined part, the entire fleet has to be, or would be theoretically, fuel tested to see what the fuel economy was. And you know that fuel economy is tested on the highway cycle, that is on the open road, it's tested in the city cycle, and then there's an averaging of those two. But so the combined fuel economy of all the cars in the fleet that a particular manufacturer sells in Australia is then averaged and a standard is set. Now, you're probably wondering what this is all about and why does it matter? Well, what it's all about is that other countries, or every other civilised country in the developed world, with 2 exceptions, already have these standards. The 2 exceptions being, wait for it, Russia and Australia. So in Australia, we have no fuel efficiency standards for our cars. In America, they've had such a standard since 1977. When they introduced it, it was something like 18 miles per gallon, that an average, the combined average fuel efficiency of all the vehicles in the fleet of General Motors or Ford or whatever it was had to achieve that. Over the years, they've tweaked that standard, so it's something like 44 miles per gallon now, or in the rest of the world's money, about 5.3 litres of fuel consumed per 100 litres. Now, that's what it is. You might wonder why it is that we don't have such a standard in Australia, and why does it matter? The reason we don't have such a standard in Australia is that for the last decade or so, the government has been disinclined to introduce one, simply by saying it's not necessary. We don't need it. There's nothing wrong with the fuel standards and the fuel efficiencies of our vehicles, and we don't need it, and so we're not going to introduce it. Now, why does it matter? Well, it matters for a couple of reasons. The first of those reasons would be when you go to the service station and fill your car up and you pay your $2 a litre or whatever it is for fuel, in an ideal world, you would get 100% energy, or 100% of the energy released by the litre of fuel that you use would be used to power the car. At the moment, that's not the case. I don't know exactly what the figure is, but only a certain percentage of the energy available from a litre of fuel is used to power the car. Some is wasted in heat generation, and a lot of it just goes out the tailpipe. So you're not necessarily getting the best value for money out of each $2 litre of fuel that you could do under the current non-existent fuel efficiency standard. The second reason it matters is because of the quality of the air that we breathe. Now, medical experts who know more than I do say that one of the greatest causes of preventable death in Australia is simply the air that we breathe. That sounds amazing to consider, but think about all the sorts of respiratory problems that people have, from asthma through to emphysema to even some cancers, that are made worse by the poor quality of the air that we breathe in Australia. And that's because, when you think about it, most of the people in Australia live on the eastern seaboard, a small bit around the southern seaboard, around Victoria, and across into South Australia, and then a small strip in southwest and Western Australia. We live in big cities mostly, and those big cities have lots and lots of cars in them. So it matters because it affects the quality of the air that you breathe. And now consider these things. Australia has a population of about 25 or 26 million people. We have 12 million registered light passenger vehicles. Now, the light passenger vehicles are the ones that are featured in this video. They're the ones you find in your driveway. They're the ones you drive to and from work and do the weekly shop and school run and all that sort of stuff in. They don't, and these combined average CAFE standards only apply to them. They don't apply to the heavy-duty trucks that move freight between the capital cities and so on. They only apply to light passenger vehicles. Australia's 26 million people with 12 million cars means that for there's about one car for every two people in Australia. But if you think about it, there are a whole bunch of people under 17 who can't drive cars, and there's a whole bunch of people in their late 70s or 80s and beyond who've had their licences taken away or are in nursing homes and can't drive cars. Though the people who can drive cars so that figure is probably more than one car for every two people, more like one car for every 1.5 people or something like that. Our share of global greenhouse emissions is about 3%. So we contribute 3% of the total amount of noxious gases that go into the atmosphere every year. Of that 3%, around about 20% comes from all forms of transport, that is trains, boats, planes and cars. Now, of that 20%, about 60%, because there are so many of them, that is the 12 million, comes from light passenger vehicles. So, if we're going to improve the quality of the air in the cities where we mostly live, we have to get the emissions from our vehicles lower than they are. And the idea of these CAFE standards is that that's what they will do. Now, the problem is this. The government is going to spend this bit of $1 million every year for 4 more years to develop these standards. That means it's going to take us another 4 years before we get a fuel efficiency standard. The problem is the standard already exists. It exists in the United States. It exists in Europe. And the manufacturers know what that standard is, and they meet it in both of those jurisdictions. Otherwise, they can't sell their cars there. If they don't meet the standard, there are 2 options that are available to them. One is they can buy credits from another company that does meet the standard, and that would be a company that produces, say, solely electric vehicles, and therefore their cars have no emissions, so they've got lots of credits to spare. Or they can pay a fine, a monetary fine or a penalty, and continue with business as usual. What they do, in fact, is they introduce more fuel-efficient cars. They introduce smaller cars and lighter cars, and most of the manufacturers now are going down the path of introducing electric vehicles as well. So the average fuel efficiency across the fleet, including electric vehicles, meets the standard. What happens in Australia is that the manufacturers have no incentive to meet the standard because there is no standard. The manufacturers have no incentive to produce or introduce to the Australian market lighter, cleaner, more fuel-efficient vehicles because there is no standard to meet. Equally, they have no incentive to make more electric vehicles available here because they say, well, people aren't buying them, and because they don't have to meet any fuel standard, there's no reason for them to divert those electric vehicles from other markets to Australia. So my issue isn't that the government is going to spend this money or do this thing. My issue is that, first of all, it's going to take them another 4 years, and by the agreement of all the scientists in the world, we've spent the last 10 years in what have become known in Australia as the climate wars, wasting time and wasting money instead of dealing with the issue. That's the first thing. The second thing is the standards already exist. And so rather than spend 4 years developing our own standard, what we could simply do is speak to the European Union, speak to the National Highway and Transport Safety Authority, as I think it's called in America, and say, we'd like to look at your CAFE standards, we'd like to adopt them as part of our own standards. Can we do a copy and paste or something like that and pay a fee, but the fee ought not to be $7.5 million. Now, as I say, I acknowledge that $7.5 million in a $1 billion budget is like the change you find down the back of the lounge these days, but it's $7.5 million that need not be spent. It could be done for much cheaper by, as I say, consulting our friends in Europe, consulting our friends in the United States and in Canada, saying and the United Kingdom for that matter, what standards, what is your fuel efficiency standard, how does it operate, what are your expectations, how do manufacturers meet it, and adopting that standard. And what it would do then is give the Australian consumer a whole bunch more of cars, models to choose from, because the manufacturers would have to introduce more models to the Australian market to meet the standard. Now, you would have greater choice, and I feel that in the process, prices would come down. Over time, not immediately, but over time, the quality of the air in our cities would improve, and if we were serious about reaching net zero by 2050 or whenever it is that the government has said we were going to do it, we'd be closer to it now than rather than spending another 4 years waiting for it to happen. The government could say to all the vehicle manufacturers who know what the standard is because they meet it elsewhere, we're going to give you a period of grace from, say, now until the end of 2023, and as of January the 1st, 2024, this is going to be the fuel standard. This CAFE standard is going to be adopted, and this is what it's going to be. So you as a manufacturer have a couple of choices. Number one choice, you can flog off all the cars that you've got now at a discount price and get them off the lot. Number two, you can decide that which cars in your fleet don't meet the standard in Australia and put them on the container and send them back to where they came from. Or number three, you can introduce more fuel efficient vehicles and more electric vehicles, and therefore the average of your fleet will come down because those vehicles will have either lower emissions or, in the case of the electric vehicles, no emissions. Now, I should point out, I should have said this at the very beginning of this discussion, when these standards are adopted, which, as I say, the government's going to spend 4 years working them out, when they're adopted, they'll have no effect on the car that you currently own. They only affect new cars that are sold. So if you have a car that's 1 day old, 1 week old, 1 year old, 1 decade old, you will still be able to drive that car. You will not be forced to sort of get rid of that car because it's not fuel efficient. It just means that when you go to buy the next car, it will have to meet that standard. And if it doesn't meet that standard, then the manufacturer will not be able to sell that vehicle in Australia. So there's no suggestion that the standard will result in all of those cars that we have now and love being taken off the road. It's simply to say that for all new cars, as of whenever the date of this standard is implemented, will have to meet the standard, and if they don't meet the standard, then they can't be sold here. All right, well, so that's what I wanted to talk about today. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. I hope you've enjoyed looking at all the cars while I've been talking. And perhaps if you're interested in the motoring world, you'll keep an ear to the ground and an eye out and see if there's any more information comes out about these standards in the next little while, and what it is that the Australian government eventually comes up with. Thanks for watching and listening.